August 15, 1971. It was a Sunday night at 9 p.m. Families across the nation were gathered around their televisions, watching the popular show Bonanza. Suddenly, the program was interrupted. The networks cut away, and the voice of the president filled the airwaves. Richard Nixon addressed the nation in a calm tone. He announced a major change. The dollar's promise to be tied to gold was ending. For years, $35 in cash could be exchanged for an ounce of gold. Nixon called the change temporary and told Treasury Secretary John Connally to stop letting people trade dollars for gold. Nixon assured everyone their money would keep its value. He said your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today. But what was declared temporary became permanent. The consequences were enormous. By 1974, $100 had lost about 22% of its purchasing power. Prices were rising. People felt the pinch. Now, in 2026, a dollar from 1971 buys only about 12.3% of what it could back then. It's a loss of roughly 87.7%. The dollar weakened, and life became more expensive. And then, there's the debt. It grew quickly. Back in 1971, the national debt was around $408 billion, about one-third of the economy's size. Today, it has exploded to nearly $39 trillion. That's larger than the entire annual economy. Gold was an important part of the story. By 1980, it had jumped from $35 an ounce to over $800 an ounce, and now it trades at more than $3,000. As gold's price climbed, so did the cost of many other things. But few people know the story of the man behind the scenes, the one who worked the hardest to make it happen. He was a tough Texas politician who believed America had been too modest for too long. His name was John Connally. He played a key role in the decision to break the dollar's last tie to gold. Now let's travel back in time and understand how it all started in detail. Back in July 1944, while World War II was still happening, leaders from 44 Allied nations met in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their goal was to create a new financial system to bring order to the global economy. The deal was simple enough for anyone to understand. The US dollar would be at the center of this system. Other countries' currencies would connect to the dollar, and the dollar could be traded for gold at a fixed rate of $35 an ounce. It worked like a courtroom claim check. People trusted the system as long as they believed the gold was really there. This idea became a reality when Congress approved the Bretton Woods Agreements Act in 1945. The system was fully running by 1958. For the next 20 years, it helped rebuild Europe after the war and made life better for many Americans. It gave strength to the middle class and made the dollar the most reliable currency in the world. Then, the math began to rot. In the late 1960s, the United States was spending heavily on the Vietnam War and the Great Society, while more dollars were being created, and the gold pile was not growing with them. More paper. Same Mel. Foreign governments started to notice that the claim checks were multiplying faster than the coats in the back room. They began quietly turning in dollars for gold before the window closed. By 1971, the U.S. was running low on gold, and government leaders realized they couldn't keep the promise that the Bretton Woods system was built on. John Connally was not a quiet man. He was born in 1917 in Floresville, Texas, a small ranch town, the son of a tenant farmer and a bus driver's daughter. Nothing predicted that this boy from a ranch town would one day hold the financial fate of the world in his hands. He climbed through Texas politics, served as Secretary of the Navy, became governor of Texas, and in 1963 Saturday, in the motorcade with President Kennedy, when the shots were fired in Dallas, Connally took a bullet that day. He survived, and when he came back harder. In 1971, Nixon made him the Treasury Secretary. Interestingly, Connally was not an economist. He was a power politician, and that was exactly why Nixon wanted him. Connally looked at the world economy the way a trial lawyer looks at a hostile witness. He did not want to charm it. He wanted to beat it. His attitude was blunt enough to survive half a century as one of the defining lines of American power. The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem. Then there was Paul Volcker. He was the opposite kind of force, not the loud man in the room, but the technical one. By 1971, Paul Volcker was the Undersecretary of the Treasury for Monetary Affairs. He spent months leading a secret group to plan how to stop gold convertibility and handle the consequences. He had already decided that the Bretton Woods system could not last with the current policies. At Camp David, he became the main technical planner for the changes Connally wanted. On the evening of Friday, August 13th, Nixon summoned roughly 15 top officials to Camp David in the Maryland mountains. The reason was secret. Foreign governments were not warned. The press was not told. Even some of the men invited did not know the full agenda when they arrived. Inside were Connally, Volcker, Fed Chairman Arthur Burns, George Shultz, William Safire, H.R. Haldeman, and a small circle of men who understood that the old system was cracking. Connally opened the first session with a full package. Close the gold window. Let the dollar float. Impose a 10% import surcharge. Freeze wages and prices for 90 days. He wanted the whole thing. And he argued like a man trying to force history through a locked door. According to Haldeman's diary, Connally said, "We can't cover our liabilities. We're broke. Anyone can topple us." Arthur Burns pushed back hard. He supported wage price controls, but he warned that closing the gold window was too dangerous. He argued the rest of the package would electrify the world on its own. He feared retaliation. He feared chaos in trade and finance. He even warned that America's adversaries would use the move to claim capitalism itself was collapsing. Burns wanted Nixon to try everything else first and suspend convertibility only as a last resort, and it almost worked. Haldeman noted in his records that on the evening of August 13th, President Nixon expressed doubt about closing the gold window. He told Haldeman that he, quote, leans to Arthur's view about not going ahead with the gold window. Nixon then directed his aides, John Ehrlichman and George Shultz, to talk to Treasury Secretary John Connally and try to convince him to back off from the plan. Think about that. One private conversation, one late hesitation, one moment when the path of the world economy may have shifted by inches. But by Saturday, the current had turned back. The discussions returned to the combined package. Volcker, who had prepared for this moment for months, would not call it a disaster. In Haldeman's account, he said some observers would see it as the United States finally, quote, biting the bullet. By Sunday morning, the decision was effectively made. Under Bretton Woods, foreign governments could take their dollars to the United States and exchange them for gold at $35 an ounce. That worked only if America had enough gold or enough credibility to honor the promise. By 1971, it had too many dollars circulating around the world and too little gold behind them. The country had written more receipts than it could redeem. Carley's answer was not to rebuild the gold backing, it was to end the redemption. At 9 p.m. on Sunday, August 15th, Nixon went on national television. He blamed international money speculators. He said the measures would stabilize the dollar. He used the word temporarily. William Safire wrote the speech to make people feel calm. Then Nixon said the words that would be remembered for decades. Your dollar will be worth just as much tomorrow as it is today. For a moment, it looked like he might be right. The Dow Jones Industrial Average jumped 32.93 points on Monday, August 16th. This was a record one-day gain at the time. Bond yields fell sharply. Investors loved the wage price freeze and thought inflation was finally being crushed. Inside the United States, it was good, but for other countries, it was miserable. Japan called it the second Nixon Shock, and the Bank of Japan had to buy more than $600 million in one day to keep the yen from breaking parity. In Europe, major currency markets closed, officials were dragged back from summer vacations, and the European Commission reacted with what contemporary reports called astonishment. Then the dominoes began to fall. The first domino was the old fixed-rate currency system starting to fall apart. By 1973, most major currencies around the world were no longer tied to a fixed rate and began floating against each other. Over the next few years, big changes happened. Countries worked to officially end the old gold-based system. The Jamaica Accords of 1976 were a key step. Then, in 1978, the IMF made more changes. These actions marked the full end of the Bretton Woods system. The second domino was inflation. It didn't happen all at once. Inflation began creeping higher, 4.3% in 1971, then 6.2% in 1973. By 1974, they had surged to 11.1%. This steady rise chipped away at the value of money. A dollar that once felt reliable was losing its worth. Over just 3 years, $100 lost more than 1/5 of its purchasing power. Day by day, tomorrow arrived, and with it, the dollar's ability to buy less and less. The third domino was the ordinary people. These were the ones far from places like Aspen Lodge, where big decisions were made. They were the people who had never even heard of the word convertibility. Yet, they were the ones who felt the effects the most. They discovered what had happened not through announcements or headlines, but through their everyday lives. Groceries cost more, paychecks didn't seem to go as far, and savings shrank in value without any warning. For them, it was about facing the reality of making less money stretch further in a world that suddenly felt more expensive. Consider the example of Linda Morales, a composite minimum wage worker in Cleveland. In 1971, a 40-hour week at a federal minimum wage of $1.60 an hour gave her $64 before taxes, enough to cover roughly two-thirds of a month's median rent. She was not getting rich. She was hanging on. Then prices rose, year after year, faster than wages for millions of people. And the kind of paycheck that once looked thin but workable became a treadmill. Then we have Frank Dorsey, a composite saver in Pittsburgh with $10,000 in the bank in 1971. By 1974, after that 22% loss in purchasing power, his money still said $10,000 on paper, but it bought only about what $700-800 would have bought before the shock. He did not see a burglar. He saw a statement. That was the cruelty of it. The money remained. The value drained away. Just like Linda and Frank, we have Evelyn Carter, a composite retiree in St. Louis, trying to live carefully. In 1971, $100 was close to a full month's median rent, and a new Ford Mustang cost $395. Decades later, the same $100 retained only about 12.3% of its 1971 buying power, and the old arithmetic of retirement no longer made sense. Her check could stay the same. Her life could not. Paul Volcker understood better than most what had happened to the economy. He had helped to create the system that removed the dollar from the gold standard because he believed it had to happen. But knowing it was necessary didn't mean it was harmless. During the 1970s, inflation kept rising, and people began to lose trust in the strength of the dollar. By 1979, when Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve, he made the tough decision no one else was willing to face. He raised interest rates to almost 20% to stop the inflation that had grown after 1971. Millions lost their jobs. A recession hit. But the inflation broke. Volcker later said that almost everyone in the room at Camp David had been fairly sure they would have to suspend convertibility at some point. They knew the old promise was dying, but they did it anyway. Today, the United States carries about $39 trillion in national debt, and the dollar is backed not by gold, but by government promise and global habit. Since 1971, Washington has run deficits almost every year, borrowing again and again against that promise. A minimum wage worker could earn roughly two-thirds of a month's rent in one 40-hour week. Today, a 40-hour week at the federal minimum wage covers less than one-fifth of a typical monthly rent. So when people ask what Camp David changed, the answer is not abstract. It is your rent, your wages, your savings account. John Connally's actions at Camp David reshaped the global economy forever. What started as a plan to solve an immediate problem turned into a complete transformation. Before 1971, the dollar's value was tied to gold. That connection kept the currency stable. But after Camp David, the dollar became tied only to trust. Trust in governments, trust in systems, trust in promises that can be broken. Connally was blunt about what this change meant. He famously said, "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." He was speaking to other nations, but the effects reached everyone. Without gold to back it, money could be created at will, deficits could grow larger, debt could pile up, and 50 years later, the same system remains. It fuels expansions, but it also deepens crises. Trust, unlike gold, is easy to spend but hard to restore when broken. So, when you hear politicians say deficits don't matter, think of 1971. When new money floods the economy and prices rise, remember Camp David. Decisions made over one weekend ripple across decades. Who pays for temporary solutions? Often, it's not the people who made the decisions. The past teaches us what only if we listen. The next chapter of this economic story is still being written. Subscribe to the channel, there will be many more such stories ahead. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and read your thoughts or recommendations in the comments section.